Alrighty, guys, welcome back to our second episode of Parables in Pastiche. This episode, we're going to be talking about the death of marriage, the death of the traditional relationship, and it's kind of a follow-up episode to the last episode we did, which we got good reviews on. So I'm joined with my buddies Devon and Prophet, and I'm going to play the intro for the show, and after that. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Devon because last time he did a great job on the initial foundations of our discussion with the hopes that from this episode you will understand or stand under what's going on better than you did before. To stand under something implies that you're willing to stand underneath the foundation or to stand under an idea. And you want to make sure that you understand those ideas before you build atop them. So without further ado, I'll play the intro and then we'll get into it. Alrighty, guys. So we definitely beefed up production quality just a little bit, so I hope you guys enjoyed that. But on the death of marriage in the traditional relationship, Devon, take it away.
Yes, and thank you for your introduction, Urban. That was amazing, and it's amazing to have everyone back here again. Welcome to Parables and Pastiche. And today is going to be a very important episode because, like Urban said, it's definitely segueing from what we were talking about before. Because I would say that one of the big problems with hypersexuality has to come with also the breakdown in traditional relationships and in marriage. And the first thing that I really want to outline here is how people are being introduced to relationships and to sexuality from extremely young ages. And one thing, especially nowadays, when you look at it in context to what we did in the past, the level of purity that children operate in with sexuality has changed drastically. Where in the past, kissing someone when you're in the 5th or 6th grade was a monumental feat, right? Now, those 5th and 6th graders have already been watching pornography potentially. So what does that mean for their first kiss? What does that mean for how they're going to see their girlfriend in 6th and 7th and 8th grade if they've already been seeing hardcore sex happen in front of them basically for years at that point? And the main point in bringing this up is that time period in our life when we are supposed to be living in purity, okay, it builds the foundation for how we then act in relationships in the future, right? And especially when there isn't proper guardrails being put on children expressing their sexuality, it really does create this weird gray area where now we have 14, 15-year-old girls on TikTok making very, very doing very disgusting dances for very old men. And that form of sexuality is extremely predatory, right? And it's setting up this positive feedback loop, right? That then takes forward what lots of attractive girls then think sexuality is in the future and expresses it, right? And it shows, and all these things in culture are bellwethers to this, how popular OnlyFans has gotten, how popular Instagram models have gotten, right? I mean, Kim Kardashian is one of the largest celebrities in the cultural zeitgeist, and her claim to fame was a sex tape, right? And it's one of those things, and she was also quite young in that sex tape too, in her early 20s. And there definitely is a weird obsession with the sexuality, the sexualization of young girls in specific in our culture. And I think that it's potentially creating the preconditions for all this promiscuity, right? All of this mate choice selection destruction, the reason why Gen Z is not getting in long term relationships, right? And God knows what's going to happen with Gen Alpha. I really do think a lot of it, all right, or at least one large factor of this breakdown in early relationships in the youth has to do directly in part with this early radicalization of sexuality on the internet, right?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Everything that you said is very worrying, very troubling, and I think it's just something that a lot of people either they don't really want to think about it, or they've kind of tuned it out. But this is definitely a problem that's played out primarily within the last two generations, the millennials and the Gen Z. And you're right, I worry for the next generation, but Prophet, why don't you go ahead and chip in here and let us know how you feel?
Yeah, you're completely on point, Devon. And one of the other key aspects to this whole equation is you kind of brushed over it, but when you're that young and you learn to internalize your own sex drive a certain way and how you see people who you consider sexy or hot, that really does destroy your chance at a genuine relationship if
Yeah.
from the get-go, before you even have your first kiss, what you understand a relationship to be is a place to get sex. And that's largely what it's seen as socially, you know? It's not even about being with a girl. It's about whether or not you fucked that girl or whether or not
Mm.
how far did you get with her. So there really isn't any space at all for a genuine relationship anymore. At least with the people that I hang out around my age group. It just doesn't exist.
No, absolutely. And in the past, it used to be a very common thing for, young guys to court women in the potential for marriage. And now the idea of getting married when you're young is seen as irresponsible, right? While the
Mhm.
latter and having sex with dozens of different people isn't, right? But it's one of those things where it has been completely lost on people, the idea of forming a legitimate connection, and it's mostly in part, in my opinion, due to the fact that we had very terrible examples growing up. Just the amount of divorce within the Gen X generations and millennials as well is profound, right? And uh, the divorce rates, and I would really emphasize all the viewers to not take my word for it and look up the statistics for yourself. The jump in divorce rates from boomers to their children is absolutely insane, and the fundamental destruction of that divine communion where it used to be taboo to divorce a partner, right? That being throwing that out the window, it made divorce, right? And I forget the law that it's exactly what it's called, but it's something like no fault divorce, right? Like the second no fault divorce was allowed on a large scale in the legal system, it destroyed marriage because marriage became a not a divine communion with God between two spirits. It became then a governmental contract, right? And that is the biggest problem, and that fundamental breakdown is really what has front ran a lot of this misplaced sexuality, in my opinion, and a lot of this turmoil in young people's relationships, and
Yeah.
even in the relationships that did stay together, I would say weren't that great. The boomers did a number on us, to be completely honest.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And you're completely right. That moment is when the law no longer considered relationships sacred. They merely considered it a contract, like you said. And that, I think, created the cultural and social environment that allowed these TikTok algorithms and Instagram algorithms to engineer our children the way that they are and engineer this promiscuity. I mean, they're only seeing videos of women who are sexually flaunting themselves and their body to these dance moves, and that's what's popular. And you want to become popular because if you're not popular you won't get X, Y, and Z. And I don't think that would have been able to happen if it wasn't for what you just said, making marriage no longer a divine union or a sacred union. rather just a contract, which is inherently selfish, the way that we see contracts these days.
I would agree with that, and that really is one of the main things to stress here is that marriage, and again, this is discounting everything. Like I'm not saying it is Christian or some specific religion, but what I'm saying is, even if you don't subscribe to any type of belief system, marriage is still fundamentally a uniting of opposites, that being male and female, to bring about new life. And so in ancient understanding, this was viewed as a holy sacrament. This is something we discussed in the previous episode. And so now that it's kind of entered into this realm of pastiche, there's that word again, pastiche, what's happened is that people don't view it as much as I just described as they did previously. Now it's more what can what can I get out of this? What can you get out of this? Are we having good sex? Are we having fun together? Whatever. And now a lot of people are really not interested in having children. And to each their own. But at the end of the day, when a marriage is made or formed, and there's no desire to create new life or to I guess put the capstone on that basic unit of nature to bring about the child, the third. If that's not done, then really you're going to run into a lot of problems, because humans were traditionally meant to come together in that basic formula. So really, this does have spiritual connotations, even if you don't subscribe to a certain belief system. This is just basic biology. And again, here on this show, we're not going to tell you that this is the one absolute truth. We encourage you to make up your own mind on what we're presenting to you, but we're going to embrace basic biology here, and we're just going to use that as a basis of reality. So basic biology, you have dogs and cats and other animals. They do the same thing. You have a male wolf and a female wolf. Well, then they mate, and then you have a little baby wolf that comes out. It's just the way it works. So,
No, absolutely. And taking that forward with biology too, I think that one very large problem, especially with the breakdown of marriage, is the breakdown of the youth's ability for economic mobility, right? And the very oppressive economic conditions that we currently have ourselves in it's the same thing where animals do not reproduce in the wild if there isn't a very flourishing set of circumstances for them to have their youth, so their children don't just die, right? Gen Z and even some millennials have been put in this situation where they're still living with their parents. They do not have any economic mobility. They can't afford a child, right? So therefore, like Urban was saying, well, if the point of marriage and if the point of having a relationship with someone with the opposite sex is to, in part, produce, right, offspring, okay, that third part, well, then if you don't have any money to do that, which is the main reason why people say they don't want to have children because of how expensive a child is, right? Well, then what are relationships being based off of? They're being based off of people's own wants, desires, and pleasures. And it resides within the hedonism, because having children has been taken off the table completely for most people because it's not a reality in their economic situation. And this is a whole nother thing with how the oppressive economic circumstances that Gen Z finds themselves in really destroys our quality of life. Because while boomers were buying homes for, I think, around 3 to 4 times their yearly income, right, we're being forced to try and buy homes at 15 times to 14 times our yearly income, right, with inflation railing us harder every single year. And this is a whole nother dynamic that we could honestly make a whole nother episode off of, but it's something that cannot be discounted, because all these things play in together to create this situation in the West that we have, where there's not really any real marriage and relationships forming in younger
Yeah,
generations.
yeah. I'd even take it a step further and say, speaking on the psychological aspect, when you have a relationship, a real relationship, and especially a child, you cognitively change. The way you see the world changes. Your value system changes. You start to act for tomorrow. You start to act for this child, for the greater
Hormonally too.
relationship. Yes,
It's
literally.
crazy.
So if you aren't getting into those relationships and you aren't having children too or wanting to have children, then it'll be even harder to overcome the economic position that we find ourselves in because you'll be working alone and your motivations will be, like you said, completely hedonistic. There will be no internal psychological force pushing you towards bettering yourself, bettering your relationship, making yourself someone worth imitating. Because that's
Yes.
the other thing. When you have a kid, they're imitating you, they're watching you. Like you are essentially their whole world until 8 or 9. So,
No, completely. And to expand on that kid thing too, like the philosophical expression of having a child is almost the ultimate form of selflessness. Okay?
hmm
Because you are then creating you're bringing life into the world that is basically your responsibility other than your partner's as well. So like having a child, okay, and really dedicating your life towards raising and giving that child the best set of circumstances for them to like prosper in their life, that is a inherently selfless act that is based
hmm
in very little ego and pleasure and hedonism. It's the opposite of it. Right.
yeah, that's interesting that you say that because even now we see a trend of, I think it started with baby boomers, but it's really prevalent in Gen X that you're trying to make your children a second chance for your life. You're trying to make them do what you wanted in your life. And I think that's inherently selfish because your children are going to have their own wants, their own desires. You know, just because you wanted to be a drummer doesn't mean your kid's going to want to be a drummer. And you know what I mean? But it's another incarnation of how relationships have become so selfish rather than selfless. It's pastiche to what relationships should be. I go so far to say.
Yeah, so one of the things that we definitely wanted to bring up here is this idea that specifically, and this is something that's just now beginning to be talked about within the last maybe 3 to 5 years, but this generation raised on social media such as Snapchat, Instagram, honestly, all of it together. I think that that is definitely something that has eroded the capacity for these people, these children at the time, but now as they enter into young adulthood, to conceptualize a relationship, along with the death of divorce, or sorry, the death of marriage with divorce. Because when you grow up in a household that only has one parent, and it could be just a single mother or just a single father, but you don't have an example of love to understand it. It's called modeling within psychology. So children learn by watching. So when they're small children, they see mom and dad. Well, mom and dad love each other, and so that's what love becomes. And so when you have a high divorce rate and you have broken families, there is no standard for love. And so where are they learning what love is? Well, they're learning it from television, they're learning it from social media, they're learning it from their peers. And this is just um, a disaster waiting to happen. And now it is beginning to happen. And now lawmakers are beginning to ask questions about Instagram and social media. And really, so much damage has already been done by this idea of assigning value to the looks, in that you get likes, you get dopamine hits, you're getting stimulation from people giving you these electronic compliments in the form of a like. So they hit the like button. Oh, well, they like how I look, and so that's reinforcement. And so social media really becomes they are called Skinner boxes. The psychologist B.F. Skinner, he created these little boxes where they would put rats in the boxes, and the rats would eventually condition themselves. They could press a button and they would get a pellet of food, and so they would condition themselves over time. And that's kind of what social media has become. So I'm interested to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah. Well, I think moving with the Skinner box, it's a great analogy because it's not just an analogy, it's just an incarnation of how it's actually functioning. But if you imagine yourself as a Gen Alpha kid scrolling on TikTok, you are seeing the world in a way that, like you said, you're going to emulate it. Everything that you're seeing, you're going to try to emulate it to fit in socially. That's a natural instinct. So if you're just seeing the more sexual someone is, the more likes that they get, the more they flaunt their body, the more popular they are. People seem to only care about the videos where people are flaunting their bodies. It's going to inevitably engineer their reward circuits to not
Monetary.
only, yep,
Monetary too.
to
That's a big part as well. That's a really big part.
oh yeah, dude. They become engineered to literally look at the world through a promiscuous lens and to act in a promiscuous way to be rewarded in the Skinner box.
No, absolutely. And then you have the dynamic too, where it's like every single girl that's basically sentient, like and is above like 12 has their cash apps. Not 12. 12 is probably a little young, but like basically any attractive girl nowadays has their cash app in their bio, right? Because I mean they understand these things. They understand the power and leverage that they get through sexuality, right? And the amount of money that they can get and fame in part as well, and it completely warps the actual way that they should be interacting with their sexuality. And it gets back to when we were talking about before, the breaking down of locality, from dating and mate choice selection. It turns into the fact that you might have had 10, 20 partners in your small town to now you have millions of potential partners, right? With millions of potential backgrounds and millions of different income streams, right? It sets up, especially for the upper echelon of where the mate choice sexual selection sits, right? The very attractive women, the very attractive men. It completely sends all of the spoils to their way, and then leaves the rest of the dating apps completely devoid, and men. And this gets into very specific things when we're talking about like how the top, I would say, around 10% of men in the dating apps basically get 90% of the likes. There is a very weird kind of reversion happening in mate choice selection, where it's becoming more primitive, it's becoming more based on looks, and it's also being augmented, by the filters, and really just like we were talking about, rewiring that circuitry of sexuality in people's brains fundamentally.
Yeah, and I mean, it seems pretty simple when you think about it like this. If only the top 10% of men and the top 20% of women are getting all of the cake, then it's only a matter of time until the other 90% of men start to emulate the actions of those 10% of men that in this promiscuous, fuck anyone you want, be pushy world that we live in, they're going to start to emulate that. They're going to start to be fuckboys. They're going to start to fuck around. They're going to start not caring about, their partner's mental state. They're going to start seeing potential partners as just sex objects. And because why not? He sees people who he considers fuckboys doing that to women and being what he would consider disrespectful. And, he's getting tons of play.
One thing I would just like to add here, real quick, is that this episode here and this subject, on the death of marriage and relationships, this really does follow up with our first episode, which was about sexualization of youth and culture. And so what's gone on is that because we've got this hypersexual culture, now sex has been discounted, and now it is, as I said in the previous episode, what they've done is they've disguised lust under the guise of love. And so now when people say, "Oh, I love you," they say in their mind love, but it's actually lust. And so from that, now when you bring in social media, when you bring in this dating scene and the way that dating has morphed with the online dating apps, and we're going to get into that here in a moment, the online dating apps, uh, with the discounting of sex, the pastiche sex that we have now, and it spreads. So now that sex, the highest sacrament to life, is become pastiche. Now the relationships that follow from it are going to become pastiche. And again, pastiche is just a mockery. It is that there's something, and it has to be imitated because you are not original in and of yourself. So all you can do is hijack that which is original. So it's kind of just turned into a bit of a joke, or a real life South Park episode is the way that I like to explain that. It's like we're living in a real life South Park episode now.
Sometimes it feels like we're living in a real life South Park episode, like more and more every day, actually.
Well, absolutely. I mean, things just keep getting more and more absurd, and I think that one big problem too is the fact that the West birth rates, just all of these things. When you're just looking at it from the most basic statistics, birth rates are collapsing, right, in the West and in lots of parts of the East that are heavily developed. Right, people just simply aren't having kids anymore, and then that's in almost direct correlation with all the divorce rates, right? And that's almost direct correlation with, oh, all the dating apps started getting very popular right after COVID, and not really even after COVID, really after 2016, 2015ish, when iPhones and really started taking over. Um, you know, these things all happening in line. Okay, the death of Christianity as well. All these things, they're hyper correlated, and the backbone to a stable society are prosperous families, right? Strong family units. Because if you don't have strong and consistent family units, communities collapse, right? And this is one very specific, you know, anecdote, but look at the Black community, right? So many poor Black children are being born out of wedlock, and that is fundamentally destroying the family unit, and it's spreading out to this promiscuity. It's spreading out, and even the statistics as well. Like, I think it's something like 70% of Black men don't ever have children. It's like almost the same distribution in the dating apps, right? And that has wrecked the Black community in many ways, and that is what is going to keep happening and pushing forward into our culture if we don't start actually respecting ourselves on a fundamental level.
This is
Yeah,
that idea behind the nuclear family. I'll be quick so you can chip in, Prophet. But the idea of the nuclear family. Why do they call it nuclear? Well, because and oddly enough, you have proton, electron, neutron. We have mother, father, child. But at the end of the day, if you have atoms out there and the atoms are missing electrons or they're missing protons, uh, things are not going to be good. And in much the exact same way, when you have families missing a mother, families missing a father, you're just going to have an unstable situation. And as this spreads, it's going to make society itself unstable, because society is comprised of the nuclear family. Families comprise society. So
yeah. I mean, that's exactly the point. And that's what I think a lot of people miss, is that they think a functioning society can happen with just purely individuals. But that's not how it functions. Individuals make up families, families make up tribes, tribes make up towns, there was supposed to be a natural progression between family, state, and federal government. But because the family has been completely broken down, and we have been utterly, like we were talking about the breakdown of locality, those two things have kind of pushed us away. Like you said, it's literally like atoms that aren't structured properly. They don't have all the structure that they need. So when that breaks down, it makes sense that we're seeing all of the issues that we're seeing in our society and in our culture. And I think you hit it on the head, Devin. It's about respecting ourselves. It's about being honest with ourselves and where we are and what these things actually are and what they mean and what they're used for. And to not misuse your sexual drive, not run up your body count, you know what I mean? Keep yourself somewhat sacred. If you can respect yourself and your family can respect themselves, that's the start of change and that's the start of healing. But the breakdown of locality has all but destroyed that possibility. I mean, I can't relate with my own family that I live with such a way that I could talk to them about this. Or you know what I mean? Like the family is so far broken. It's so far gone.
very true, and a lot of that has to do with again, I feel free for anyone in the audience. I mean, you don't have to agree with me here, but I think a lot of it does go back to the entertainment industry, goes back of course, social media. It goes back to the music that people are listening to. You know, one thing to note is that if you go back to music from, maybe like, let's say, the 1950s, 1960s, you would hear these songs about, love, but it would be in a positive sense. But now the songs that are about love are typically coming from this place of trauma. It's like, oh, I was in a traumatic relationship and now I'm hurting. That's what the content of the music and such is now. Even in some of those genres like country music, where there really is some of that still, it's getting much more doom and gloom. That it's viewing the relationship like a eulogy of sorts. They're kind of eulogizing the traditional relationship, and it doesn't help that we're kind of being told as a society now that there is no value to the nuclear family. And again, I don't hate anybody who might disagree with that, but at the end of the day, I will argue that there is a fundamental value to the nuclear family unit, simply because if you go and you look at nature, you know you have this pattern in all mammals. I mean, you have a male and a female that join together to make a third, and that is why it is something that is definitely important. And it's just being completely and utterly discounted. That doesn't matter. You can do whatever you want. It never meant anything, and that is a problem, and that is something that can be changed. And hopefully, we'll do that to whoever encounters this episode.
Hmm.
No, absolutely. And I think that one thing to really touch on too that we haven't gotten to in this dialogue is the breakdown of traditional gender roles, right? Like
Hmm.
one thing that really was like the glue of marriages, especially like 50, 60 years ago, was this kind of traditional outlook people had on gender roles, which over the past 20 years that has been thrown completely in the trash, right? And desecrated. People no longer, like, it's almost sexist now to assume that your wife will play into feminine gender roles when you get into a marriage, right? That she will do laundry or take care of the kids. And a lot of this has been done in part due to the fact that our economic mobility has been destroyed, right? It's now a necessity almost for a woman to work in the household, or else you're not making enough fucking money. It's just the cold, hard truth. And this kind of emasculation, this masculation of men or of women that has happened, right, for just the sake of the economic reality of the situation, them having to work, it has really thrown a lot of things off. And then this is when we get into schooling and factory schooling, and when that was all set up, and the introduction of women into the workforce, correlating with Horace Mann setting up the modern education system in America. All these things correlate very heavily, and it really is just around the fact to where there was a very large shift that started happening after World War II, and that shift was to make the family unit integrated with the government, and eventually to make the government the family, right? And this
Hmm.
is what is slowly happening, I believe, and especially when you just, you look at the very obvious, um, like nowadays, families, right? Like you were just saying, Prophet, families, if there is a political discussion, will completely, if there is a political disagreement, if you have a Trump supporter uncle, right, and then a niece or an aunt that is a Democrat, okay, that could be a potential sever. That could sever the relationship. That could ruin the relationship, essentially, right? And
Yeah, you're
this
completely right.
it's the radicalization of the family unit, and it's the turning of government into a greater family, and a greater it's the government is the father, essentially. That's what they're trying to do. And
Wow.
and women being forced into the workforce with, how they've set up the economy since World War II, it has basically destroyed most American children's ability to be raised by their parents. And now school becomes the de facto daycare raiser of your child, right? The second they turn 7 years old. So it's the government that is raising our children now, and
Yeah,
that's a
I'd even
Let me
whole other
chime in
thing.
really quick, really quick.
for sure.
In response to what you said about the state being the father, as a matter of fact, that is a very old concept. Traditionally, the state was the father, and the church was mother church. So your mother was the church, and this is a traditional idea when it comes to society building and culture building. And so the ancients, at least the elites, have definitely understood that idea. But you've hit the nail right on the head. And one thing that I would like to emphasize real quick is that uh, this whole the basis for this whole argument lies on, as if you are a female, a woman, you're told, okay, go out and work, and you are much stronger for that. You're stronger for that. And if you want to go out and work and have a job, fine, do that. I 100% believe in women having all the rights that men do. But at the end of the day, what is the definition of strength? Okay, maybe the female has some money or whatever, but typically, like Devon said, this is just because people need that money to survive. And then the children are not getting as much time with their mother or their father. So really, maybe financially you are a little bit stronger, but this whole argument that the quote unquote liberation of women and and just you know screw the family unit. What is the definition of strength? How is this strengthening women? Because in a lot of respects, I feel like women have actually been much damaged, very much in that argument. I don't believe it's made them stronger at all. I think it's actually harmed them very, very greatly. I mean, so many women today have been victims of sexual assault. You've got men who are just creepy men, and I say that as a 25-year-old man myself. Some of the behavior I see from my own peers, just in my life watching other people, some of the things I see are genuinely shocking, and I feel empathy for these women because I don't understand what's going through some of these guys' heads. So it seems like it's not strengthened anything. But go ahead.
Yeah, well, do you have something to say, Devin?
Yeah, I just wanted to say this real quick. I just had to, just so I wasn't talking at my ass, I looked it up. So the APA, the American Psychological Association, found that as of 2022 of December, 1 in 14 women between the ages of 18 and 25 are taking antidepressants, and that it's up 74% from 2021. So, just from a
Yeah.
statistical standpoint,
Is there a
um,
graphic?
yeah, here I can just I'll send
Send
the.
send me the graphic, and I'll actually go ahead and put it up on the screen for people to see it.
Thanks,
Because
Urban.
I would like to see that as well. Um, yeah, that's outrageous, and really, you run this danger past a certain point. If the majority of people are mentally unstable and taking antidepressants, the majority, well, then at that point, wouldn't mental illness just become normal? So nobody's mentally ill because everybody's mentally ill. You get what I'm
Yeah,
saying?
one of my I hate this term so much, and this is a bit off course, but my mom uses the term neurospicy, or she says, "Well, I'm just not neurotypical." And the point you just made is so significant. None of us are neurotypical. There is no such thing as neurotypical. In the world with the environmental factors that we do, it isn't whether or not you have a mental ailment, it is to what degree do you have a mental ailment, because everyone's executive function isn't properly functioning. Motivation is such a big issue. You know what I mean? And I think you're completely right. It's the fact that everyone is sick to a certain extent, yet somehow we have this idea that it's normal. Antidepressants are normal. It's normal to go to therapy. Therapy is a great thing. If you need therapy, go to therapy, but N I think it's not okay that a majority of people in our society need it. You know what I mean? That's a bell if I've ever seen one.
Yeah, and it completely and utterly, and Devin and I had talked about this a while back, just when he and I were having a conversation. And it's that in modern psychiatry, So often, and I know all doctors are not like this, but so often the psychiatrists are very overloaded. They have a lot of patients, and so they kind of bring you in there. Is your medicine working? Do we need to make any changes? Okay, have a good day. They're completely and
Hmm.
utterly discounting the environmental factors. They're looking at nature. Okay, you were born maybe this deficiency in this neurotransmitter or something, but it completely and utterly discounts the environment. I mean, what if the person's just living a hellish life and the only normal response is that depression and they don't talk about it? And now we've got a completely backwards dynamic, and that you're not going to help anything when you don't understand that. But
Exactly, exactly. I have this so a little personal tidbit. It'll be short. I haven't talked to my dad since I was 16, and I have some step siblings from the girl that he married, and dude, I empathize with them every day because their mom, who my dad married, absolute master manipulator, psychopath. Like literally doesn't matter. She will manipulate you to get what she wants. And that was enough to make me never talk to her or my dad again. But on the other side of the family, their biological dad is an actual abuser. They have told me multiple stories of him kicking their children off of chairs. So kids these days, Gen Alpha, they are stuck between a rock and a hard place. It is regular for them to have two types of abuse at two different households, which they're split between, which is already psychologically so damaging. Then to have your parents fighting each other, you're caught in the middle. It's like, doy, they're gonna be anxious, depressed, not be able to function in school, overeating. Like, yeah, you probably would too. But no, no, you're just not neurotypical. Your serotonin isn't working properly. Let's put you on some depression meds. That'll work.
Well, and this is getting a little off topic, but at the end of the day, this is something that RFK outlined that is very pressing in just the way that we view healthcare in the United States, and that's that we view these illnesses from a material perspective, right? Like what Urban said, you might have some neurotransmitter misfunction, right? You might actually have a serotonin deficiency.
Mhm.
You might actually have dopamine misfiring, but like at the end of the day, 95% of people that are being prescribed these mind altering medications are not going through, they're not even getting a fucking blood test, let alone
Mhm.
getting their neurotransmitters checked. Like this is a very large problem. It's that like the healthcare system has become this big strong arm for like enforcing this idea that people are becoming depressed as individuals. It's not the sick society, right? It's not the fact that like nobody's making any money anymore, right? Nobody has good relationships, divorce rates are spiking, nobody's having kids, right? Kids are fucking on all these different drugs, right? And it's not that, right? It's just the fact that like, oh, it's your little individual problem. You have to pick yourself up by your bootstraps, right? You have to make it work for yourself. And this is the
Mhm.
thing where it's like the amount of cultural responsibility, right, that is put on the average person, right, in the context of how like bad things have gotten is just absolutely ridiculous, right? And it's just it's oppressing. It's oppressing, and it's a part of the reason why like people aren't forming good relationships anymore because people aren't actually facing their demons, right? Because they think that the fucking SSRI or pill that they're going to get is going to fix the existential destruction in their soul that is happening from like how oppressive and satanic our society is. Like,
so one thing you said made me think of one of my favorite quotes of all time, and so I'll say that just because I think it fits beautifully here. It is no measure of health to be well adjusted to a profoundly sick society. And I'll say that again. It is
Oh,
no measure of health to be well adjusted to a profoundly sick society. And I think that sums up everything you just said.
agreed. You did an awesome job, Devin, of circling that back around to the original topic. I'd like to add a little bit more to that circling back. Um, as a viewer, you may have noticed that a lot of these things that we're talking about seem to be heavily correlated, and that's true. So, a lot of these environmental factors that we've just gone over, they aren't mutually exclusive from what we were previously talking about, the destruction of marriage and breakdown of relationships. Because if you live in a world where the responsibility is put absolutely on the individual, like you said, Devon, yet the individual is taught that you're not able to fix that. It's just your biology. Well, it's just where you were born. Your truth, your truth. There's no room for actually solving the real issues, which is rooted in the promiscuity of children and that correlation to the breakdown of relationships and stuff that goes along with that. These things aren't mutually exclusive. They go hand in hand, and you can't have one without the other. We would never have been able to exist in this world if the family unit didn't break down to the point it did. If the government didn't become the father and the education system became the mother because your dad and mom are off working all day, you know? It all goes hand in hand.
No, absolutely, and I think that this is a whole nother subject that we could get into. I mean, the presence of parents in the household, like how much people have to work nowadays to sustain children, right? Like
Hmm.
most guys, like even if you're working the average work week, right? Like 35, 40 hours a week, that is still a lot, right? That is, if you have any bit of commute to work, right? The only time you're going to have any time for your kids is on the weekend, right? And this is why, like, it's a very it's not talked about, this segment of all of it, but everyone feels it. It's the, like, lack of economic mobility, and it's the ever shrinking amount of wealth that, like, the average person has. I mean, it is completely oppressing, and it destroys any real ability for you to have mobility and to really, like, raise your kids. I mean, for your kid to even go into sports, you have to shell out a few hundred fucking dollars and your own time to bring them to practice, right?
Yeah.
And that's a whole that and if your kid's going to practice every night or every other night, that's another responsibility, right? And people aren't it's like building relationships with your kids is now become a luxury in society almost.
And I think the key to what you said is the fact that when you live in that environment, you do not have the time to self reflect and ask yourself, what am I doing to this child? How can I raise them better? Are they hanging out with the right friends? Are they developmentally in the right position? Like, what are his interests? Am I fueling his interests? Am I developing a relationship with him? There is no time for that. When you have a 45-hour or 50-hour work week, if you're raising a kid, then you take them to practice, then you only have the weekend to do it. You're just so exhausted that rather than reflect, you go to sleep, or you send them to the water park and you relax in the sun because that's all you have the mental energy to do. All of these things also contribute to the fact that parents aren't thinking about parenting. They're in survival mode essentially. At least a
No,
lot of the
absolutely.
time they are.
That's very true, and really, at the end of the day, there are definitely parents who could have done a better job parenting. But at the end of the day, I don't fully say that that it's just because these people are bad parents. No, this is what happens. If you go back to a book like 1984, the premise was that everybody was basically living in this socialist slave society. And so when you actually get into a society where people are working themselves to death, practically slaves, uh, this is what happens. You get this collapse of the family unit, you get this collapse of the community unit, and then you introduce something like social media on top of it. And that was what Orwell actually was unable to explore. I mean, he had the technology, they had these cameras in their rooms or whatever, but the whole idea of social media was something that had not been understood or thought of. It's a very new concept, a new and raw concept, I might add, because nothing like social media has ever existed before, um, in the way that we know it. And so that was kind of a Pandora's box. And you got to remember, humans were existing in small, tight knit groups for all of recorded human history. All of recorded human history. Maybe you lived in a big kingdom or town or something, and so you knew the people nearest you. But now it's like somebody who lives in China can call me out for something, and I'm all the way to the United States. It's like now we're at the mercy of the entire world. The eye of the world is what social media is. And that's one thing I recognize with like the older generation versus our generation. And I will personally argue, and maybe we'll do a show on this soon, that the younger generation born after technology was, or social media technology was mainstream, fundamentally has different patterns of thinking, in that when we talk about these things with our elders, our parents, our grandparents, they are viewing it from that old traditional, this is your community, this is your town, your people you went to school with. But the people that are our age, who were born into this social media matrix type idea, you know, we see the whole world. It's like our eyes are on the whole world, and theirs are still rooted because they were raised in small, tight knit communities.
Yeah, and I think you can see that in the fact that um, people, when they want to make change, the first thing they do is they make a YouTube video. They don't go talk to their immediate circle. And like you said, not many people have that large of an immediate circle or that well connected in their local society. I mean, I don't know my next door neighbors. I lived in my last place for 10 years, and I never once were friends with my next door neighbors, friends with anyone in that apartment complex. So I think you're completely right. People have this. I mean, it's a good thing, right? We're looking at the whole world. We're looking at the entire game. We're not just focused on our small world, which allows things over there to kind of happen without us realizing it and seeing the influence that it has on us. But on the other hand, we don't have any local community. We don't have any local network. Like,
Individuality is sacrificed, because when you sacrifice so again, once you sacrifice the nuclear family unit, that erodes the community slash local unit. And once the local identity, which has been, like I said, that tribal traditional community that human history has been based on, once that's eroded, then what happens is the individuality of the whole thing falls apart, because now we don't necessarily view people as individuals anymore. And that hasn't been aided by violent video games, violent television, violent music, because now it's like literally let's go back to that the healthcare executive that was shot. Again, I'm not agreeing or disagreeing with it, but I just found it fascinating that people were so able to laugh at it and make it a joke, not 30 minutes to an hour after it happened. It was a meme. It was just a joke. It was not anything serious. Nobody just died. Love the guy or hate the guy. I mean, somebody just got shot on the side of the road and people are already laughing at it. And if that doesn't speak to something, I don't know what does. But we're running up on the hour mark. And I don't care to go over just a little tiny bit if we need to, but Devon, would you recenter us back on any points that we need to cover or wrap up with before we end here?
No, yeah, I think just to connect with the sanctity of life thing, I mean, the sanctity of life, we could get into the abortion topic a little bit too. I think that the abortion, definitely, the concern that women voters had with abortion during this election, where it was almost their number one issue, especially for younger women, it's another facet of kind of showing this matrix of the breakdown of the sanctity of life, right? And us viewing life as a very sacred thing. People, and that sanctity of life and respecting life correlates directly with, you potentially having a kid, you wanting to raise that next moral set of the generation, right? Like it all comes together into the individual wanting to be more Christ-like, wanting to, embrace traditional values and to like raise children that they potentially will see benefiting society and benefiting themselves in the future. I mean, it's just so important.
Yeah,
I mean,
I'm gonna just chip in real quick, and I'll turn it over to you, Prophet. Just real quick, one thing, and I just want to state this because sometimes people miss out on that subtle layer. What we're talking about here in response to abortion is not whether we agree with it or we don't. All we're saying about the issue is that because it has been something that has become more common very recently in the course of human history, because it has become more common and it has been introduced as a possibility for people out there. Now that it is a possibility and it is something that is, this is an option, what it has done is it has kind of led to this idea that human life can be devalued. And here's another example. It's not just unique to abortion. War, war, and the like is the same concept, because if you grow up in a, for instance, let's go all the way back to the Middle Ages with the 100 Years' War. It lasted a little bit longer than 100 years, but that was like 2 or 3 generations that were born into just war. And so that is a complete discounting of human life. When you're just seeing dead bodies and people getting blown up and stuff, it's like human life is less valuable in when you see it, when it is something that's in your mind. It's not something that happens consciously. It's something that happens subconsciously. So that's important to note. But Prophet, go ahead.
Yeah, I think that's extremely important to note. I was just going to point out the fact that though abortions have always been around, the rise in the number of abortions, illegal and legal, um, jumped during the baby boomer over sexualization, um, promiscuity time. Like the generation before baby boomers, I mean, they literally, the baby boom happened. Like having an abortion was not even a consideration. But once sex became more open, parties about sex became more open, you know, that whole freedom and liberation hippie thing, I think there's a direct correlation between that and the number of abortions that happening, just to show one correlation between this and our greater subject.
It's a really big factor you didn't account for too.
What?
All of the strongest men died. All of the warriors were killed in the blood sacrifice ritual that was World War II.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, wow, I mean, with the number of people that died, they essentially killed the father figure to what? Replace it with the
and
government?
then the men that got home were, I mean, they saw atrocities, and I mean, who knows, they weren't the same men coming back. Men coming back from war are not the same that left, right? So that's something that people discount massively, right? The amount of young, right, and older men that were potentially, because men that volunteer for war, men that willingly go into drafts, those are the most likely going to be traditional, most masculine men. And if you have a war like if you have multiple wars like World War I and World War II that basically genocide massive swaths of these able-bodied young men, I mean, what is that going to do? It's going to leave the ones, right, that were left that are less masculine. And I think that's a part of the trend that is discounted massively when we're talking about what happened with World War II, at least in World War One.
Yeah, and I'd say specifically that is a key factor to what allowed the death of masculinity to happen.
Yes, it's a part of it. Absolutely. There's a thing that I forget exactly what this is from, but to corrupt a society, you have to get rid of the strong men, and once you get rid of the strong men, you can corrupt the women, and then once the women are corrupted, you can get to the weak men.
Beautiful. So true. That just rings true throughout all of history, if you're looking at societal degeneration over time.
So I would just, I think it's probably a good point to wrap it up with any final thoughts or whatever. The goal for this was that we wanted to keep these episodes at the right size, because really we could ramble on about this topic for a long time, but we want to kind of make it succinct and easily digestible for people. So we'll cap it off around an hour. Again, if we need to go a few extra minutes, that's fine. But is there any final thoughts anyone has, or?
So I guess my final wrap-up statement is just that however disparate these situations may seem, they are all heavily, heavily correlated, and the root issues are very common between a lot of these issues. And that's it.
Yeah, and then last thing I want to clarify too. I did say probably around halfway into the podcast, I misspoke. I meant to say that 70% of Black children were born out of wedlock over the past 5 decades. Not that 70% of Black children or of men didn't have children. Basically, Black men didn't have children. So just wanted to clarify that so it didn't sound retarded.
10-4.
Well, I'll just kind of cap it off, guys. We're going to try to to make progress on these episodes, it probably all throughout the week. So expect, maybe 4 to 5 episodes. There might be 1 or 2 days that we're busy or something comes up, but we are just going to choose a subject, and eventually we're going to bring some guests on. We're going to bring on a fourth person, and we're going to try and pick a subject that they would be, in their area of expertise, and we'll talk to them and just let them join the discussion. And I've got a long list of people that I want to get on in good time, whenever we can do it, whenever we have time and they have time. But we definitely want to bring some interesting people in on these discussions. And again, if there's anything in these episodes, if you disagree with me on this, you disagree with him on that, just write a comment. Let us know why you think that. We'll be happy to take a look at it. But again, I said this last time, we're not going to put up with any animosity or anything. We're going to try and keep this as rooted in truth and factuality as possible. And on that, I'll leave it with one of my favorite quotes, and that's per solum fidem and veritate, which means by faith in the truth alone. And faith in the truth alone is one of the most powerful concepts, and it would be the same thing as the faith in Jesus Christ, because Jesus is the truth and the light. He himself says this. So if by faith in the truth, that is faith in Jesus. Jesus is the truth and the light. But with that, guys, I hope you enjoyed this, our second episode of Parables in Pastiche. And I think the connection that Prophet spoke of is pastiche. This is all pastiche. This is all taking something sacred, which would be the great universal human experience, and it is a defiling of all things that are sacred. And that's what pastiche is about. And that is the link between all of these concepts. And we hope to help people understand it, so that we can kind of wake up and make a change about it. Because once you fall too deep into pastiche, only a dangerous dose of reality can free you from it. And that'll be a sad day for anyone involved, because it will be a dangerous dose of reality to wake us up. But, guys, we appreciated you listening to our ramblings. We'll be back with more, and we wish you guys the best. Take care,
Thank you
everybody.
for listening, guys. Have a good one.
Yeah, thank you. Have a good one.